There is a moment that almost no one warns you about. It doesn't arrive with a scream or a slammed door. It arrives quietly, usually on an ordinary evening, when someone you love is mid-sentence, telling you about their day, their problem, their pain, and you realize you feel nothing. Not sadness, not anger, nothing. And for a person who has spent their entire life feeling everything, feeling everyone, this absence is more terrifying than any emotion could ever be, because you have just met the version of yourself you swore you would never become. Cold, distant, unmoved. And the strange part is, it doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like relief. And that relief frightens you more than the coldness itself. If you have ever been called sensitive, too much, overly emotional, if you have spent years absorbing other people's moods like a sponge absorbs water, if you have apologized for crying, apologized for caring, apologized simply for feeling things at a volume other people never had to manage, then you already know what I am describing. You are what people call an empath. Not in the mystical sense, not a superpower, not a personality quiz result. In the Jungian sense, you are a person whose feeling function has been left permanently open, undefended, unfiltered, absorbing the emotional residue of everyone around you as if it were your own. And for years, maybe decades, this made you the one people came to. The one who understood. The one who never turned anyone away. Until the day you did. Carl Jung believed the psyche seeks balance the way the body seeks temperature regulation. When one function is overused for too long, the system does not ask permission before it protects itself. It simply shuts the function down. And this is the piece almost nobody tells the exhausted empath. Going cold is not a personality collapse. It is not proof that you were never really kind to begin with. It is a psychological circuit breaker. Your feeling function, the very thing that made you generous, attuned, endlessly available, has been drawing from a well that was never refilled, and one day the well runs dry, and something in you simply stops reaching for the bucket. You didn't wake up one morning and decide to stop caring. That is not how it happens. It happens in 1,000 small withdrawals you barely noticed while they were occurring. The friend whose crisis you absorbed for the 5th time that month while your own problem sat untouched in a drawer somewhere. The family member who called you only when they needed something and vanished the moment you needed anything back. The partner who mistook your bottomless patience for bottomless capacity. Each of these moments took a small piece of your emotional reserve and never returned it. And an empath does not notice depletion the way other people do, because an empath has spent their whole life trained to monitor everyone else's needs before their own. You were the last one to notice you were running out, because noticing your own exhaustion required a kind of self-attention you had never been permitted to practice. Jung wrote about what he called psychic inflation, the state in which a person becomes so identified with a role that they lose contact with the rest of themselves. And the empath's role, the healer, the listener, the one who always understands, is one of the most convincing masks the psyche can build, because it looks like virtue. It feels like love. Everyone around you benefits from it, so no one questions it, least of all you. But underneath that mask, a resentment quietly accumulates. Not because you regret being kind, but because kindness without boundaries is not kindness at all. It is self-erasure wearing a compassionate face. And the psyche keeps a ledger even when you refuse to. Every unreciprocated act of care is logged somewhere beneath conscious awareness, and eventually that ledger comes due. This is why the coldness, when it finally arrives, feels less like a decision and more like a verdict. You are not choosing indifference the way a cruel person chooses it. You are being handed indifference by a nervous system that has run out of alternatives. Think about what happens to a muscle that is never allowed to rest. It doesn't get stronger from constant use. It tears, it seizes, it stops responding to signals it once obeyed instantly. Your capacity for empathy is not infinite, no matter how much the people around you have treated it as though it were. And when it finally ceases, when you finally stop responding to the signals that used to move you instantly, to tears, to comfort, to self-sacrifice, you are not broken. You are protected, at last, by the very system that spent years being ignored on your behalf. But here is what almost no one tells you about that protection. It does not feel like strength in the beginning. It feels like grief. You will grieve the version of yourself who cried at other people's pain, who stayed on the phone until 3 in the morning, who gave without counting the cost. You will look at your own detachment and wonder if you have lost the best part of yourself, the part that made you good, the part that made you loved. And this is the exact moment where most people misunderstand what is actually happening inside them. They believe they are losing their humanity. In reality, they are recovering their boundaries. And a boundary, to a person who has never had one, always feels indistinguishable from cruelty at first. Before we go further, if any of this is landing somewhere uncomfortable in you, somewhere specific, take a second and subscribe to Jungian Mindset. This channel exists for people exactly like you, the ones who gave until there was nothing left and are now trying to understand what happens on the other side of that. There is more waiting in this video that I think you need to hear, so stay with me. Jung spent a great deal of his work studying what he called the shadow, the disowned parts of ourselves that we refuse to integrate because they feel unacceptable. Most people assume the shadow is made only of cruelty, anger, selfishness, the traits we are ashamed to admit we carry. But the shadow also contains something quieter and far more surprising. It contains our unclaimed right to say no. For an empath, the capacity for coldness, for detachment, for refusal has often lived entirely in shadow, buried under decades of conditioning that told you your worth depended on your warmth. And when that coldness finally surfaces, it does not surface gently. It surfaces the way anything repressed for too long surfaces, abruptly, without warning, sometimes aimed at people who did not entirely deserve the full weight of it. This is why the exhausted empath's turn toward coldness often comes with guilt so heavy it feels like punishment. You snap at someone who has genuinely been kind to you, and the shame afterward is unbearable because your entire identity has been built on being the person who never snaps. But consider what Jung might say about this moment. The shadow does not emerge to destroy you, it emerges to complete you. The coldness you fear is not the opposite of your empathy. It is the missing half of it, the half that was never allowed to develop because you are too busy managing everyone else's emotional weather to build a shelter for your own. Think about the people who benefited most from your endless warmth. Not all of them, but some of them. The ones who called only in crisis, who complimented your patience while quietly relying on it, who never once asked what your capacity actually was before pouring their problems into it. These people did not necessarily set out to exploit you. Some of them are simply products of the same conditioning you are, people who were never taught to check whether the well they were drinking from had a bottom. But whether or not their intentions were malicious, the effect on you was the same. You became a resource before you became a person to them. And resources, once depleted, are not comforted. They are discarded and replaced. This is the part that stings the most, and I want to say it plainly because I don't think anyone has said it to you plainly before. The moment you stop being endlessly available, some of these people will not ask if you are okay. They will ask what happened to you. They will imply that you have changed, that you have become harder, colder, less like the person they used to know. And in a strange, backwards way, this reaction is confirmation of everything you needed to know about the relationship. Because someone who genuinely valued you would be relieved to see you finally protecting yourself. Only someone who valued what you provided, not who you are, experiences your boundary as a betrayal. It is worth sitting with how strange this reaction actually is once you look at it clearly. If a friend told you they had started sleeping more, eating more regularly, finally resting after years of running themselves into the ground, you would not accuse them of changing for the worse. You would be glad. But when an exhausted empath finally rests emotionally, finally stops absorbing everyone else's chaos as a full-time unpaid occupation, the reaction from certain people is not gladness. It is something closer to panic. And panic, in this context, tells you exactly what role you are actually playing in their life. Not friend, not partner, regulator. You were the nervous system they borrowed when their own could not hold steady. And a person who has been quietly borrowing your stability for years will, understandably from their own frightened perspective, experience this withdrawal as abandonment, even though what actually happened is that you simply stopped subsidizing a stability that was never yours to provide indefinitely. Jung believed that individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a fully realized person rather than a collection of roles assigned to you by others, requires exactly this kind of rupture. You cannot become whole while remaining permanently available to everyone who has ever needed a piece of you. At some point, the psyche insists on retrieving what has been given away for too long without return. This retrieval is not gentle. It rarely arrives as a calm, well-reasoned decision to start setting limits. It arrives as sudden exhaustion, as numbness in situations that once would have wrecked you emotionally, as a strange new silence where your instinct to comfort used to live. And this is precisely the coldness we are talking about. not cruelty, retrieval. Consider what it actually costs a person to remain endlessly emotionally available. Every time you absorb someone else's crisis as though it were your own, some part of your nervous system treated it as a genuine threat to manage. Every time you stayed calm on the outside while quietly overwhelmed on the inside, you paid a physiological price that most people never see, because empaths are extraordinarily skilled at hiding depletion behind competence. You learned to function while running on empty, because functioning while running on empty was the only way you had ever been shown love returned to you. But a system cannot run on empty indefinitely. Eventually, something in you calculates, correctly, that continuing this pattern will not lead to survival, and so it shuts the tap. Think back to childhood for a moment, because this is usually where the pattern first takes root, long before you had any language for what was happening to you. Maybe you were the child who noticed a parent's mood shift before anyone else in the room did. Maybe you learned to read tension in a hallway, in a slammed cupboard, in the particular silence that meant something was wrong, and you learned to adjust yourself accordingly, to become smaller, quieter, more agreeable, whatever the room seemed to need in order to feel safe again. Jung believed that the psychological patterns we develop in childhood do not stay in childhood. They become templates, quietly repeated in every relationship that follows, until something forces us to examine them consciously. The empath who exhausts themselves in adulthood is very often the child who learned that being attuned to everyone else's emotional state was the price of safety. And a child who learns this does not simply grow out of it. They carry it forward, refined and disguised, into friendships, into romantic relationships, into workplaces, applying the same vigilant, self-erasing attentiveness to every room they enter, long after the original danger has passed. This is part of why the coldness, when it finally arrives, can feel so disorienting. It is not simply the end of a habit. It is the interruption of a survival strategy that has been running, mostly unconsciously, for decades. Your entire nervous system built its sense of safety around staying attuned to others. So when you finally stop, when you finally let a friend's crisis land without immediately absorbing it, without immediately rearranging your own emotional state to accommodate theirs, some part of you does not experience this as freedom right away. It experiences it as danger. This is why the early stages of emotional withdrawal often come paired with anxiety rather than relief. You are not just setting a boundary, you are dismantling a survival system that once, a long time ago, genuinely kept you safe. What makes this even harder to sit with is that the people who will criticize you most harshly for going cold are often the same people who never once checked whether your warmth was sustainable. They enjoyed the output, they never asked about the source. And now that the source has protected itself, they experience the absence of your warmth as a personal insult rather than what it actually is, a long overdue act of self-preservation. This is not a coincidence. It is the exact dynamic Jung described when he talked about projection, the tendency of people to see in others only what serves their own psychological needs. To them, you were never fully a person with limits. You were a function. And when a function stops performing, people rarely ask why. They simply look for a replacement. But something important happens in the space after the coldness settles, something almost no one discusses because almost no one survives long enough in that cold, quiet place to notice it. Once the initial numbness passes, once the guilt of no longer being endlessly warm begins to soften, a strange kind of clarity moves in. You begin to notice which relationships were built on mutual respect and which ones were built entirely on your capacity to give without asking anything in return. The people who remain, who stay curious about you even when you are no longer performing warmth on demand, reveal themselves as the ones who were never using you to begin with. And the ones who disappear the moment you stop over-functioning reveal something too, something you needed to see far earlier than you did. This is where the empath begins. The second half of the journey, the part Jung would call the return, though it rarely feels triumphant at first. It feels quiet, almost anticlimactic. You are no longer the person who cries at every sad story you hear, and part of you mourns that. But you are also no longer the person who absorbs a room's anxiety and carries it home in your chest for 3 days afterward. The empathy is not gone. This is the most important thing to understand. It has not vanished, it has relocated. It moves from an uncontrolled reflex, triggered by anyone in your radius, into a deliberate choice, offered to people who have shown they can hold it responsibly. This is not the death of your sensitivity. It is the maturing of it. Notice too how quickly this new discernment reorganizes your entire social world without you having to say a single confrontational word. You do not need to announce your boundaries to most people. You simply stop performing the old role, and the relationships sort themselves accordingly. The people who only ever wanted the function you provided will drift, sometimes quickly, sometimes over months, towards someone else who has not yet learned to protect their own well. This can feel, at first, like proof that you are unlovable without your usefulness. But look closer and you will see it is proof of the opposite. It reveals exactly how conditional certain kinds of affection always were, long before you had the clarity to see it. Meanwhile, the people who stay, who get curious about this new, less endlessly accommodating version of you, who ask real questions instead of simply missing the old convenience, these are the relationships that were never actually built on your depletion in the first place. They were waiting the whole time for the real you to show up, the one who exists underneath the performance of endless availability. There is a particular kind of strength that only exists on the other side of depletion, and it cannot be manufactured any other way. A person who has never given until empty does not know what their own limits actually are. They operate on an assumed generosity that has never truly been tested. But you know now, you have felt the bottom of the well. And a person who has felt the bottom of their own well and survived it develops something the endlessly warm version of them never had: discernment. You begin to notice, almost instantly now, when someone is asking for genuine connection versus when someone is simply looking for an audience for their chaos. You begin to feel, in your body, the difference between a person who wants to know you and a person who wants to use the parts of you that are easiest to extract. Jung often spoke about the second half of life as a period defined not by acquisition, but by consolidation, a turning inward after decades of turning outward. The exhausted empath going cold is, whether they realize it in the moment or not, entering their own private second half of life, regardless of their actual age. The first half was spent proving your worth through endless availability. The second half is spent discovering that your worth was never in question and that the exhaustion was never a sign of insufficient love. It was a sign of a love so unguarded it had no defense against being taken advantage of. None of this means you become hard forever, incapable of warmth, permanently withdrawn from the world the way people fear when they first feel the coldness arrive. That fear, the fear that you are becoming someone unrecognizable, someone incapable of love, is usually unfounded, though it rarely feels that way in the early weeks of withdrawal. What actually happens, for most people who move through this stage consciously rather than running from it, is a redistribution. The warmth returns, but selectively. The generosity returns, but with edges. You become, for the first time, someone who can genuinely say no without collapsing into guilt, and someone who can genuinely say yes without collapsing into resentment, because the yes is no longer automatic. It is chosen. There is a specific kind of peace that arrives once you stop mistaking exhaustion for love. For years, you may have believed that the depth of your suffering on someone else's behalf was proof of how much you cared. Jung would likely call this a shadow belief, an unconscious inheritance from somewhere in your history that taught you love had to cost you everything to be real. But love that requires your total self-destruction is not love. It is an unpaid debt disguised as devotion. And the coldness that finally interrupts this pattern, however frightening it feels while it is happening, is not the death of your capacity to love. It is the death of your willingness to love people who never once considered what it cost you. If you are in this stage right now, if you are staring at your own detachment and wondering whether you have become someone you don't recognize, I want you to consider a different possibility. You have not lost yourself. You have finally stopped losing yourself to everyone else. The empath who goes cold is not an empath in decline. They are an empath in transition, moving from a version of themselves defined entirely by what they could give, into a version defined by what they choose to give, and to whom, and under what conditions. This is not the opposite of empathy. It is empathy that has finally learned how to survive its own generosity. So here is the question I want to leave you with. When you look back at the people who accused you of changing, of going cold, of becoming distant, ask yourself honestly what they actually lost when you stopped giving endlessly. Was it you, or was it what you provided? Because those are very different losses, and only one of them deserves your guilt. If this reached something true in you, something you have felt but never had language for, tell me in the comments with the word threshold, because that is exactly what this moment is. Not an ending, a threshold. And if you want to keep walking through it with someone who understands exactly what you are carrying, Stay subscribed to Jungian Mindset because we are only getting started.